Hey guys, this is Joseph Broughton, and we're doing a little surprise little DTK12 chat episode that is not just after the DTK12 chat Twitter chat that we usually have on Wednesday evenings. We usually have that on Wednesday evenings, and the next one's going to be with a wonderful one about design thinking and leading, and please check that out later on this evening. It is Garrett, I think. You're in the Central Time Zone, aren't you? With me?
Yeah, I'm in New
Okay.
Orleans.
Yeah, New Orleans. He's Garrett is Garrett. Can you introduce yourself? Tell everybody what do you do in New Orleans?
Sure. So I'm Garrett Mason. I'm the Director of Innovation and Design at St. Martin's Episcopal School, and I work with teachers to incorporate design thinking projects, real-world projects, into their classes.
Okay, so that's like one of the coolest job descriptions I've ever heard of. I'm envious, Garrett. So usually the chat happens at 7 o'clock on the Eastern Coast, 8 o'clock in Central, I do believe, and then there's this, there's Mountain Time and Pacific Time that some people in the Pacific, especially California, call California Time that they do out there. And I think they're 6 o'clock out there, and we normally have our Twitter chat around that time. So please tune into that this evening. There's going to be some great discussion. There's some awesome people that are just extremely wonderful and friendly and very useful to have in your professional learning network. And I've loved the relationships and some of the friendships and that I've gathered from participating in that. Today we're going to do a short, just little 10-15 minute chat about following up on our chat for last couple weeks ago. We discussed assessment in design thinking, and that is to me is a very murky place to go. Is assessment with design thinking. And just before we started recording this one, Garrett and I were discussing about the different viewpoints of assessment and how that can apply with design thinking. And Garrett just has some wonderful ideas with on how design thinking and assessment can merge pretty nicely in some ways. Garrett, we were talking about one of the things that we brought up was the difference between quantitative and qualitative, and how that relates to design thinking. Can you just discuss some of the things that you were discussing with me earlier about those differences and how we can apply those to design thinking challenges that we do with our students?
Sure. I think the idea of having qualitative assessment makes sense for a lot of the things that we're trying to measure and monitor about students' progress. Anything from sort of their mindsets, are they open, are they being empathetic, those sorts of things, where a qualitative assessment where a teacher kind of describes, their view on the student, I think is probably just a better method, a better fit for assessing the student in that way, as opposed to putting a number, like you are 75% empathetic in this instance.
Yeah.
So the difficult part is actually in assigning grades, which is, in my mind, very different than assessment, right? I think formative assessment, giving students feedback about how they're doing, whether or not you're actually giving them a grade for that, I think is important. I know there is a lot of pressure on teachers to actually put grades and quantify what they're doing, but I think design thinking projects lend themselves a little bit more towards that qualitative aspect. So that's I think an ongoing challenge is at what instances do you grade students, actually give them a quantitative measurement on their work. So finding those instances, and then how do you actually measure that? Are you comparing that against your expectations, or how they compare to other students in the class, things like that?
Yeah, and I liked your idea of when you were talking about giving something a number is really leading towards a grade, and that in some situations, to me, and not a lot of situations, that way of communicating how a student is doing, giving them a grade, is oftentimes lacking in being able to communicate exactly what the student is doing extremely well in and may need to work on. And in both of those, that's my biggest issue with grades in general, as far as a way to communicate with students on their progress, is that number does not tell them exactly what they're doing that is both right and what they're doing that can be better, that they need to work on. And I often feel like as educators we're so pressured to, at the end of the day, to give a grade or number on something, that sometimes we forget the importance of that communication to students on a more qualitative, a more way that summarizes and is a conversation with those students, instead of it being a one-way, just sending them a grade and then that's it. And I'm thinking of I don't know if you've ever seen it, Garrett, but Blowing Up the Grade Book by Dr. Chris Haskell.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen that? Well, he talks the whole idea of we need, if we're going to be using grade books, how are we going to use grades? And he has this big presentation he does, and I'll put a link to a couple of them that I found that are really pretty cool about blowing up the grade book. But that's one of the ones that really, one of the presentations that really kind of, I don't know, it showed me that that there's people out there that are thinking about this and thinking, oh, this isn't always the best way to communicate the successes and the challenges that our students are facing, is by giving them a grade. So what ways do you think, Garrett, in design thinking specifically, are a better way for communicating what we expect from our students and how they're meeting those expectations?
Well, I think in terms of assessment, I think the qualitative assessment is sort of the way to go. And, I think both from a teacher standpoint and sort of like a metacognitive standpoint as well, and having the students do some self-reflection on, how am I working as a team member, or what skills am I learning, or what mindsets am I bringing to this project. Having them go through that process and thinking about that themselves and kind of assessing, doing their own self-assessment of those things, I think is actually extremely important as well.
I like that idea because, design thinking, that's a major component, is self-reflection. And I like that idea that assessment should encourage students to self-reflect. And it seems like if you just give them a number, or like you said, I don't know if this was before we were recording, but you're saying, are they being empathetic 75%, out of 100? Or, that number wouldn't really spur on self-reflection. Not only, like I said before, a conversation with the students, but also them self-reflecting and getting feedback. And self-reflection is a very powerful way, a powerful part of design thinking. And I think I think the assessments should encourage that, don't you think?
Yeah, I do. And as you were talking, it makes me think a little bit more about, I have a scientific background, so I actually tend towards a more quantitative approach.
Yeah.
But even the idea of, even if the 75% doesn't make a lot of sense, I think sometimes even putting a number to it, not for the number itself, but to compare it to your assessment of the student later, to really measure growth in that particular student versus a comparison between students or in any other way. I think maybe even that kind of quantitative approach could be helpful just for you as a teacher, even if you're not sharing that with the students.
Yeah, I like that, what you just said about, because oftentimes with me, grades, putting a number on something, is comparing one student to another student and seeing how well they're doing against the majority of the students, and trying to artificially create a bell curve or something. And I loved your idea of, when you're putting a number to something, sometimes it could be helping a student and a teacher gauge growth over time and giving that a specific number. I think that's a good way of looking at sometimes the need sometimes or the benefits of using something that has a number attached to it.
Yeah, I think that the idea also kind of gets back to assessing where students are individually, and the idea of growth, I think, is extremely important. And I know that I worked with a student who has Asperger's, and their growth in showing empathy, although still probably below the class average, was a huge leap compared to the growth of the other students through the design thinking projects that we did. And I think that that's something that should be celebrated and acknowledged in some sort of qualitative, form, qualitative assessment of how that student changed throughout the course of that project.
Yeah, I love that as an example, that students with some unique challenges to the situations that that are presented in the particular project that you're doing, and the skills that we're trying to get our students to do or having our students attempt. Like you said, a student with Asperger's, that empathy is going to be a special challenge for a student, and I think what you said with individualizing that assessment to help to communicate to them how well they're growing individually is a very powerful statement. I think that's a very powerful reason to kind of think of things as assessment as an individual thing and not necessarily across the classroom or across the grade level or across the district or whatever group that you're going to be comparing them to. Yeah, I like that approach, especially because sometimes those assessments don't look at the both strengths that a student brings to the table and some of the challenges that they're facing when they come to what particular task that we're encouraging the students to do.
Yep. I know that there are some schools, for instance, the Watershed School in Boulder, Colorado, that does not do quantitative assessment. It's all qualitative, and that presents particular challenges for college admissions, for instance. Even if the parents are on board with kind of assessing their children in this way, there are kind of challenges as you move from high school into college. And I mean, I think the issue of parents is another interesting one that all schools face, but in particular independent schools, where parents are spending a lot of money to send their child someplace, and I think it's more of not only getting their money's worth, right, which I think is also true in public schools too, right? You don't want the best for your children, and
definitely
paying taxes and all of that, but
yeah.
There is this sense that if my child is not doing well, like, I want to know why, and like I need to know particularly, right? So measuring something like empathy, like, oh, Johnny only got a 60 in my class because he wasn't showing enough empathy. I don't know if most teachers feel comfortable saying that, or providing the right guidance in order to improve student performance in that area. So it's typically one that teachers shy away from actually assigning a grade for. But again, I don't think that all assessment has to be quantitative, and it doesn't have to. It could be a formative assessment. Just that feedback for the students to change, even if it isn't incorporated into their grade for the class.
Yeah, I think you brought up a good point of what is the purpose of the assessment, and what is the purpose of the things that we're documenting and putting either in a grade book or some kind of documentation. Even portfolios are very useful now, and I'm seeing, even like you were saying, college admissions. I've been reading more of college admissions offices using portfolios as a powerful way. I remember whenever I was applying for graduate school at University of North Texas, one of the big things that they looked at was a paper a paper that I'd written and a set of papers that I'd written in undergrad, and it was amazing how much they were willing to base my admission on that portion of what I was submitting to them. And of course I had to do the GRE, and I had to submit my grades, but it seemed like they would look at those papers and say, okay, I can tell from these papers that you will be able to, with guidance, be able to do a master's level and then a PhD level of work. And what you were talking about with the different stakeholders and trying to figure out what is the purpose of this assessment. Is it to communicate to parents? Is this communicate to colleges that these students are ready for a college level or university level work? It seems like that's a good conversation to have about assessments, is looking at, okay, when we give an assessment or when we're documenting the results of an assessment, who's going to be looking at this and who's going to benefit from it? Who is this set of assessments and these numbers going to be used to communicate with? And
Yep.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing with you. Yeah. I think oftentimes teachers don't think about that. They've finished covering a certain amount of material, and now they're just assessing whether the student learned that material or not. And I think you're right. There's lots of different ways that different forms that assessment can take, and what the purpose of that is I think important for teachers to reflect on.
Yeah, that's great. So now my next question is, what would this look like in the classroom if you're going to have this as your philosophy? Is like, how do you create this? So and that would be definitely a good talk for another time, I think, Garrett, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. All right, so I invite others to submit as comments on this Google Hangout and the accompanying YouTube video also that will be posted. If you have ideas of how to assess students, specifically in design thinking, because of its often non-traditional in its approach to gauging student learning. And sometimes, like Garrett was talking about, how do you say that a student is, how do you communicate that well, that a student may be 60% empathy? Yeah. So please do. And Garrett, thank you for joining us, and I appreciate you talking with me and talking with the audience about assessment. And I hope this continues, and this conversation continues about the importance of assessment with design thinking.
Great. Well, thank you for having me.
All right, guys. Well, thank you, everybody, and please leave some comments and join us tonight on Twitter with the hashtag DTK12chat, and we'll be talking tonight about using design thinking to lead in education. Well, thanks, everybody. Bye.